ready to go.
Hi, everyone. Thank you guys so much for joining us for our third panel in this series, Trains, Texts, and Tits, Sex Work, Technology, and Movement. I'm super excited for today's conversation. It's going to be a really fascinating discussion about the beginning of the internet and really lead us into our last discussion next week, which is about kind of the moment that we're in now. So just to start, Hacking Hustling is a collective of sex workers, survivors, and accomplices working at the intersection of technology and social justice to interrupt state surveillance and violence facilitated by technology. And so today, once again, we're going to start with some quick introductions and community agreements. We're going to spend a few minutes really setting the scene and bringing us up to this moment in time, which is about the early 90s up through about 2010. So kind of up through the crash is kind of what we're talking about here. Then we're going to have three just incredible panelists present and then be in conversation with each other. And then as we've been doing at the 90-minute mark, so just around 1:30 Eastern, 10:30 Pacific, we're going to switch to an open conversation where that's not recorded. We're going to ask folks to turn on their cameras and their mics if they feel so comfortable, and just kind of process together, especially when we get into this conversation. There's so many different things that I think are going to resonate in a really personal way with a lot of folks, and definitely bring us up to the moment that we're in now. And so we're really, we invite everyone to be in discussion, to lurk, whatever makes you feel comfortable. And so just to start with our community agreements, first, bring in your histories and speak from your own experience. We all have such a wealth of knowledge, and it's all unique and it's all important. Be conscious of the personal nature of direct questions, especially in the chat. Just be really thoughtful about the space that we're in and the way that we engage with each other. Be committed to each other's collective learning and growing. Every single one of us is at our best on a learning curve that should constantly be evolving and growing. And we not only offer that grace to ourselves, but we offer that grace to each other. Please consider the space that we're going to take up in the chat. It can get really difficult to follow sometimes. So if you're contributing a lot, thank you. That's fantastic. And just be aware of how much that can literally fill up an entire block of text. Please be open to learning. All of us have different experiences, and we all understand that other people have different experiences as well. And collectively, we share so much knowledge. We're trying to not share pirated work, which includes books, pornography, and other art forms. So if you're going to share something, just be aware of the author or the producer, whether or not that person would want that to be shared and is comfortable with that. Respect the diversity. We respect the diversity of different identities, and especially for purposes of this conversation, it means we're not going to assume the identities of other people we're in conversation with, whether people show up as activists, as organizers, as workers. That is their choice, and that might not be the entire context of their identity, and it also might be just the way that people feel safe showing up in a space. So we're just going to be really conscious of that, and also no dead naming and no doxing. So don't share someone else's personal information or information about their lived experience without their explicit consent. We prioritize care for ourselves and for each other. You know, it's 2 hours that we're going to be in conversation. Please get up, get some water. Everyone needs to hydrate, especially during changing seasons and especially while we're inside. So please feel confident taking time and space away in the way that works for you. And then finally, please don't use ableist language, and that both is in terms of but also emotional and psychological ableism. And we can put a link in the chat, thank you, for what that means as we talk. And also sometimes we totally slip up and say things that if we had taken a minute, maybe wouldn't have been phrased in the same way. So totally feel comfortable to call yourself out, to ask someone else to reframe their language, and know that we're all learning and we're all trying to live into our values every single day. So today we have three amazing panelists that are going to share some incredible wisdom and be in conversation with each other. First off is Cinnamon Love, who uses she and her pronouns. You can follow Cinnamon. I put everyone's Twitter bios in the chat. These are three fantastic people to follow on Twitter. So I encourage everyone to do that. Second, we're going to have Melissa Jarrett Grant, and finally Tina Horn, all of whom use she and her pronouns. I'm Kate. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm co-hosting with Blunt. Blunt. And so if you want to DM either of us, Blunt is probably going to respond a little bit faster in the chat, but please feel free to contact either of us or reach out to either of us, either with questions, comments, or feedback. And so just to kind of put us in conversation, this entire series really rose out of discussing about a lot of the regulations, a lot of what's happening right now, and really realizing that this was not a unique moment and it's not actually a new moment. What we wanted to do was have a dialogue that started 200 years ago with the idea that sex workers are early adapters. Sex workers go into frontier spaces, to brand new spaces, to this week digital spaces, which are being created for the first time, and become not only early adopters, but to shape that space into someplace welcoming, someplace accessible. You go into a mining town in 1860 and turn it into a place where people want to be and want to spend money. We go into OnlyFans and turn it into a useful medium where people want to visit. And then what happens is once that space becomes desirable and accessible, sex workers are overwhelmingly criminalized and regulated out of that space, as we're seeing now with so many different digital platforms. And so in the context of that, we originally started talking about trains, talking about the frontier, talking about the beginnings of migration, global migration. And last week, we really moved into especially brand new mediums of easily publicly accessible newspapers and different ways that sex workers colonize that space too, and turn it into something that was commercially valuable. And then of course, we're regulated out of that. This week, we're going to move into digital space. And so we're calling this week Digital Stimulation, Sex Invents the Internet. And so just to kind of set some of the context of what we're talking about, because you can't talk about any of these things really in a silo, and especially when you're talking about legislation, there's so many other things that are happening at the same time. And so this week, first I'm going to talk a little bit about technology and how that changed up to the 1990s, and then talk about global movement and migration, and why understanding that is actually really important to understanding the rise of trafficking and terrorism discourse. And then finally, how this is also a moment of sex worker rights really taking shape in the way that we understand it now. So, you know, if we look at the big technological innovations over the last 40 years, a lot of that is really concentrated in the creation of the internet. So first and foremost, there was the ARPANET, which was this network that was developed by the Department of Defense, but it was really internal. It was really specific to the Department of Defense for a really long time and completely inaccessible, not even public. And so in 1990, the ARPANET is decommissioned to really create the internet in a public forum in the way that we understand now. And immediately after that, what you're talking about is companies going in and kind of making it a space to navigate. So by 1995, or in 1995, was the creation of Microsoft, Yahoo, Internet Explorer, and eBay. And right around the same time was also the development of sites like Craigslist, which were about really becoming open to the public, really about an accessibility and a space that folks could navigate. And I put eBay at the last of that list because yes, we're talking about Microsoft, we're talking about Yahoo, but what follows in the internet is not just this amazing, beautiful open space, but commerce. So not only was this space invented at the same time, but monetizing this space was invented basically the next day. How do you make money off of this? And of course, deeply important to this, the first internet cat video is released in 2005 and changes the landscape of the internet as we know it. At the same time, one of the other things that was happening was phone technology. Last time we talked about how phones over the mid-century period, so like by the 30s, 40% of households already had a phone. But you know, we're generally talking landlines. What happens in this period is that we move really from landline technology to cell phone technology. And what that means is people don't have to sit at the phone anymore. All of a sudden, people become not tied to the house where the phone is, but tied to the cell phone, and the cell phone is tied to the person. And so around 2000, we really start seeing the shift in the growth of people owning their own cell phones. And as many of us know, owning our second disposable cell phones. So right around this time, kind of post mid-century, we're also seeing migration shift again. For folks that were on our very first webinar, or conversation, migration was really important. The beginnings of global migration and those shifts were really impactful, especially developing some of these narratives around who is an American, what does whiteness mean? What does whiteness mean in the context of global migration? What does an America mean, which is not grounded in the location of where we are? It's a colonized land. And so what does this mean as, what do those things mean as people begin to shift across borders, as as there becomes much more racial integration and changing who is on what land and why people move? And so where we were talking a lot about in the 1800s, Asian migration being, post-opium wars, being coming here and then ending up in things like the Page Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act. Around the late 50s up through the 70s, what we're talking about is Vietnam and the Korean Wars, which were disrupting and were just one part of a lot of the disruption that was happening in Asia at that time, both politically and socially. And it meant a lot of displacement. It meant a lot of people forcibly crossing borders. A little bit later, and kind of at the same time, we're also talking about the fall of the Soviet Union. And so what happened in that period was that borders are opening up. The Soviet Union was most of Eastern Europe, and all of a sudden it goes from one country to a lot of smaller countries, which are still trying to find their footing at that time and still trying to figure out what borders mean. And so what these two things mean is that migration into the United States, and especially migration into Europe, is going through massive changes in the 1990s in particular. And so what we're seeing is higher rates of Asian migration than we had previously, especially when you're talking about post-Chinese Exclusion Act. Major immigration reform in the United States happened in 1950 under Dwight Eisenhower. And so the way that people are coming into the country is really different, and the racial makeup is really shifting. And so what happens immediately after the 1990s, where the European Union forms, and why that's really important to this conversation is that migration into Europe, and especially migration into Nordic countries, becomes very different. So before, you had like Norway, and they were dealing with migration in a very specific way. And Italy was dealing with migration with its proximity to other countries and other regions in a very different way. As the EU forms, that becomes one discussion, and it becomes much easier for people from different regions to move farther north and farther west in a faster way than they ever had before. And so what happens after this is really you're talking about the rise of the trafficking discourse as we know it right now. So throughout the 90s, there was a lot of conversations about migration. And what migration facilitates is, yes, people crossing borders, and it facilitates a lot of social change as well. And so when we're looking at, trafficking, as we're looking at the narratives around trafficking, which have not changed very much. So the ones that you see today are very similar and are really forming in this space. And as much as, people, and so the dialogues that are happening, especially around migrants who are taking low-wage jobs, migrants who are taking very physically demanding jobs who don't have a lot of options, maybe facing exploitation, maybe facing debt bondage, maybe facing the circumstances where you have someone pay your way to go there and then you work it off. The response was not necessarily to say we need to make migration easier, we need to make options for migrants better. The response was to criminalize and problematize the industries and the ways that people were crossing borders. So there's a lot of conversation about how bad human smuggling was. And the result was not to make migration easier. The response was to make smuggling across borders harder and to criminalize it and to really try to take away the mechanisms that people were using to cross borders. And so by 2000, internationally, you see the UN's protocol against trafficking in persons. And in the same year, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which defined trafficking as a crime of exploitation through force, fraud, or coercion. And the big fight in there was, internationally as it was domestically, whether or not anyone could consent to engaging in sex work. And so that's why in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, there's actually two pieces. There's exploitation through force, fraud, or coercion in the sex trade, and there's exploitation through force, fraud, or coercion in every single other industry. And they're actually two different crimes on the books. At the same time, oh, and that year is wrong. At the same time, we're talking about 9/11. We're talking about in 2001, experiencing September 11th led to a conversation on terrorism in particular. And why that's important is because it is speaking to this globalization and the response being one fueled by criminalization, fueled by increased surveillance, increased police presence that, as we've been talking about historically, has grown and grown and grown. In the very first webinar, we talked about how this facilitated the growth of police units as we know them, about how low-level crime was being formed. Last time we talked about how the Mann Act and Prohibition led to a massive expansion of the FBI as a police force, that it wasn't a police force before then. It didn't really exist. And all of a sudden the feds needed cops. And what this period looks to is a further expansion of policing, but one that is global and local because they're interlinked within each other. At the same time that we're seeing these changes, the rise of technology and the rise of inhabiting this technology immediately ends up resulting in wanting to regulate this technology. And so in 1996, we see the Communications and Decency Act, which is a lot about obscenity and pornography. And this was the act which created Section 230, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, which says that internet platforms are not legally liable or responsible for what gets posted on their platform. Second was the Child Protection and Obscenity Enforcement Act. Once again, it's really about obscenity. It's really about what gets posted with this idea of trying to protect children. And this was what also created 2257 regulations, which I'm sure we'll also talk about, but are specific to online, which are specific to filming porn and what information you have to keep about actors in that, really thinking about minors in terms of the information that they're trying to access. And at the same time, and I'm really excited that we get to talk about organizing even more on this, we're also talking about sex work really coming up through the 70s and the late 70s and the 80s, and then really forming in the way that we know now in the 90s and the early 2000s. And of course, anytime there is marginalization, there is always resistance. And so this is not to say that before there was the term sex work, that sex workers were not unionizing, we're not collectivizing, we're not fighting back and pushing back and demanding rights and space. This is simply to say that this, as a movement in the way that we kind of understand it, had a lot of formation during this time, a lot of concretizing during this time. We're also talking about a moment post-porn wars. So through the 70s and 80s, the feminist movement really decided that the number one enemy in everything that was going on was really porn. And second wave feminism at this time really focused in on obscenity, on the idea that pornography was inherently exploitation and that it was inherent violence. And so there were, we didn't really cover this. If you want to read more, Sex Wars is a great book on this. And it talks about kind of these internal fights that ended up really fracturing how we understood the feminist movement at that time. In 1979, Carol Lee coins the term sex worker as we know it. And I love this list really specifically because there is a number of different organizations existing now, back then, and everyone decided to name themselves after animals. And so organizations such as Prostitutes of New York, Pony, Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics, Coyote, Swan, Puma, and then SWAP, which was actually a borrowed term from Australia, all form in this period. Spread Magazine, and actually it's literally sitting right next to me. If you want to read more about Spread Magazine, there's actually a collection. Operates from 2004 to 2011 and actually operated out of the back of a dungeon in New York City. Danzine popped up in 1994 based in Portland, Oregon, and there were a number of different publications that arose because as sex workers use technology for work, sex workers also use technology to organize. And then of course, online forums start allowing sex workers to connect as well. Once it is sometimes connected to advertising spaces, such as for My Red Book, and then sometimes independently, such as the listservs that we use, or there was Hornet back there, again, another animal term, which if anyone knows why that came about, if it wasn't just like cool and that's what everyone did, please share, because I actually don't know the history of that. But yeah, as we're using technology to advertise and to find clients, technology is also the space that everyone starts organizing to connect with each other and to share that. So as we've been talking about, forms of sex work are similar and slightly different, but utilizing technology. So there's sex workers who work in physical space, and this distinction all of a sudden becomes very different. So, you know, there's folks that do street-based work, who do bar-based work, who do hotel-based work, but there's advertising, finding your clients and meeting your clients in a physical encapsulated space, which becomes different only as soon as people begin advertising in digital space. That distinction doesn't matter when there isn't non-physical space to advertise in. And so there are sex workers who work, who advertise primarily in digital space all of a sudden. And this also is, they're not two distinct circles. They have never been two distinct circles. Even now, there are people who either work and advertise both in physical and in digital space. There's people who use online platforms to say like, hey, I'm going to be hustling on this corner. So it's definitely a Venn diagram and not two distinct spaces. Porn actors, definitely grow as the industry goes. More and more actors grow, and more unionizing and organizing happen. There's phone and cam-based workers. So there's 1977 was the very first 1-900 number, and it was just one person. But that becomes an industry, and then very similar dynamics happen as cam workers start to grow. There's brothel-based workers. Apologies. There's brothel-based workers and agencies, which are still operating as they historically have been. And there's strip clubs, of course. And we haven't really talked about the history of strip clubs, but it's still important to include. And so we're actually going to start, not necessarily with questions, but with our incredible panelists. And first up is Melissa Jarrett Grant.
Hi, Kate. You sent me to my bookshelf, which conveniently, like, we're all home. So this is kind of jumping back in our timeline. This is Coyote House. This was Coyote's newspaper. This is actually Carol Lee's copy that she lent me a really long time ago, and I've been defunct on mailing it back to her. So I'm sorry, Carol, if you're watching this, I need to mail this back to you. But this is all the sister organizations from Coyote had animal names. And there were some in here that I hadn't heard of before. So in California, there was CAT, California Advocates for Trollops. In Spokane, Washington, there was Prowl, Professional Resource Organization for Women's Liberties. In Washington, D.C., there was the Spread Eagles. New York had a group called Scapegoat. Massachusetts had Puma. Missouri had Kansas City Kitties. So, and if you sign up for Coyote membership in here, it also asks you to choose an animal name, for example, Shimmering Unicorn. I don't know why the animal, I don't know, but it was a thing, and it was like kind of a national thing. And then just for comparison, I dug this up too. This is the very first issue of Spread, which is very modest, but beautiful. And like, you know, the Spread is interesting because like this comes out in 2005, which in some ways is sort of like a peak moment for sex workers communicating and hanging out online. But a magazine was still really fucking important because a magazine could like hang out in a strip club dressing room, or like you could like take it off a friend's shelf, or like it had this like physical life in like organizations that like, you know, at the time, it actually felt like, you know, we hadn't chosen, right? Like we weren't like sort of privileging like digital media versus print media. And if anything, like this was as much of a community building tool as anything that we were doing online. So I'm going to start with something from 1995. We talked about the idea of the frontiers a little bit. And one of the main internet freedom organizations at that time was called the EFF, Electronic Freedom Foundation. And they had this idea of the frontier sort of built in. There was this idea that like the internet was this Wild West. I think it was framed without a lot of awareness or understanding of sort of the colonial and settler implications of framing the internet that way. And also, you know, it's sort of this mythology of like great American expansion. Like we've expanded across the entire country. Now we're going to expand across the internet. I don't think it would surprise anyone to hear this was primarily an organization of white cis men, many of them libertarians, many of them in the San Francisco Bay Area. So at the time, Carol Lee had a website, one of the very first sex work websites that you can still access at baseone.org. And she did this Q&A with Mike Godwin, who was one of the early EFF people. If you've ever heard of Godwin's law on the internet, the idea that any internet argument ultimately devolves into somebody invoking Hitler, it's that guy. So she asked him, are there any protections that would discourage police from becoming cyber decoys? I have heard that many officers enjoy playing computer games at the station during work hours. This form of entrapment could be that sort of game. And his response is, I doubt they're staying after hours to play this game. Fortunately, the skills it takes to hang out on the internet are greater than the ones it takes to play Sega, which in 1995, the idea that cops were too stupid to use the internet to entrap sex workers like seemed actually pretty reasonable. But of course, we were like really quickly disabused of that notion. And Mike also didn't have like illusions about this. And his ultimate recommendation was like, maybe don't use the internet to meet new clients, use it to maintain relationships with existing clients, and of course, use it for political purposes because that's all protected speech. So in a way, like he wasn't totally off base, except for the whole part about the police not understanding the internet. Kate talked a little bit about like the early era of the internet, the precursor ARPANET, and just from my own personal experience, like my first boyfriend's father worked on ARPANET and was the first person to show me a web browser when I was in high school in the 90s. And so for me, like my relationship to the internet was always like real people that I know built this and real people that I know are making this. And at the time, like there were so few web pages that like basically everybody who was hanging out online was making something online. There wasn't like a hard and fast distinction between like users and creators. Like we were all involved in sort of creating this thing. For sex workers purposes, the kind of two main parts of the internet that we were using were Usenet, which was news groups, if you've heard of those, and then the World Wide Web itself, which was like not taken for granted as like the internet in the way that I think today we talk about whatever is going on in our web browser as the internet. That was just one component of it. And there were early Usenet conversations about sex work and in sex work specific Usenet groups. Alt sex prostitution was probably the biggest one of those. And then later we get into this era of personal websites. You know, porn performers are certainly at the vanguard of that. And like the whole idea of having like a personal website with a membership option as an individual brand, like this is when that was sort of like very dominant. And then the first kind of sex worker only online communities where we presumed we were just talking to ourselves were happening on LiveJournal. And a lot of the webcam girl community was all focused around LiveJournal. But there were also escort and stripper communities there too. And so it means like by the time like we get to like Y2K, the landscape online for sex work is like these membership sites are super common, cam sites are super common, and also these like large escort ad sites, things like Eros, which launched in 1999, I think. So why is all of this possible even, right? Because that was sort of the question for Mike Godwin, like, well, wait a minute, is it legal to do this stuff on the internet? If it's illegal offline, is it illegal online? The short answer is yes, but you know, speech about these things is different than doing these things, right? And porn is protected in some ways, even beyond prostitution. So Kate mentioned CDA 230. Ironically, CDA 230 comes out of the Communications Decency Act, which was this attempt to sort of use the idea of children looking at porn as a way to do a really onerous wave of anti-internet regulation that would have really harmed free expression online. And 230 was sort of drafted as an amendment to help mitigate the harms of that. Everything else in the CDA has since been ruled unconstitutional. All that's left is 230. So think of it like this anti-porn bill, essentially, the only provision in it that preserved free expression is the only part that survived. And that's also sort of still a flashpoint, right? Like around Backpage, for example, the drama around that was a huge component of it. And Ron Wyden, who was the only senator, or one of two senators who voted against SESTA FOSTA in 2018, he was one of the co-drafters of Section 230. I don't think you could describe him as like a sex worker rights advocate, but he's certainly aware of the collateral damage for sex workers caused by the rollbacks on free expression. And he opposed SESTA FOSTA for lots of reasons, but that was certainly one of them, that he saw it was going to harm marginalized communities online who didn't have the same power as these big tech platforms have now. But almost none of the big tech platforms that we think about now were like even operational in this time, right? This is before Facebook, it's before MySpace. This is certainly before sort of like Web 2.0, user-generated content. Like our personal websites are user-generated content, but like the entire internet was user-generated content. Like this was a very different moment. And a very creative and sort of like all bets are off moment. And the moment I think when that starts to shift is 2000, 2001. So 2000 is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, 2001 is the Patriot Act. And at the time, I don't think I thought of them together, but I do now. And I think it's useful to think of them together. I'm not going to get that deep into the particulars of the Patriot Act, but what's useful for this conversation to think about is they're both premised on this idea that there's these dangerous global networks that spread all over the world of criminals, and they're beyond the reach of the conventional law enforcement mechanisms that we have right now. And so we need new laws to go after them. But not only do we need laws to go after them, but we have to also go after anybody who aids them or helps them. And TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, passes October 2000, so before 9/11. But the kind of war on trafficking as we know it doesn't really ramp up until George W. Bush is in the White House. And you see in sort of the shock doctrine way that 9/11 opens the door for the Patriot Act, that kind of idea that there's nothing we shouldn't do to fight terrorism. And if you stand in the way of that, you somehow support terrorism. You see that same rhetoric around trafficking. And the thing to note, just as like the Patriot Act is like a response to 9/11, but of course it like goes so much further, and it whips up a lot of racist sentiment, anti-immigrant sentiment. It's rooted in a lot of things that came before 9/11. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act isn't really a response to like trafficking going up or trafficking becoming more visible. It's a very specific effort by two groups who were sort of on the outs at the time: the religious right, this is the very end of the Clinton years, and then anti-sex work, women's rights groups that folks Kate was talking about, who were sort of like left adrift after the porn wars when they lost. And so these two groups come together and they politicize these two separate things. One is migration for the purposes of prostitution. The other is what at the time was still probably mostly called teen prostitution, or minors who are engaged in the sex trade. And so trafficking becomes this unifying framework to talk about all of these disparate things. But what it's actually used to do is to further criminalize sex work. That's how we experienced it at the time. I think the fear of government surveillance between both of those things for sex workers' lives is almost inseparable. There were a lot of fears that the Patriot Act, for example, was used to make it easier to wiretap escort agencies, which were a big target at the time. Like individual sex workers, I don't think necessarily were as fearful, but if you were part of an organized business, or if you even traveled the circuit from city to city and worked for different madams in different places, like those are the kinds of things that were dealing with a lot of scrutiny. And so like the ways that financial transactions would be tracked to sort of like fight terrorism, you see the same sort of methods used to fight trafficking, but what they're actually doing is surveilling what sex workers are doing. And you also see at this time a massive amount of federal money going to local law enforcement. And local law enforcement is where prostitution policing is mostly happening, right? So now you're getting federal anti-trafficking money going to like local police departments to regulate prostitution by arresting people. And that's when you start to see cops hanging out online all the time, as we didn't think they necessarily would be in the 90s, but they're very incentivized now to do these decoy stings and to arrest sex workers and call that fighting trafficking. So it's this mix where like as soon as we have the web sort of open up our possibilities for making community and working together and making this industry safer and making this industry something that like we didn't have to rely on exploitative business practices that in the past like you couldn't necessarily start your own business. So all that's going on, that's very good. And at the same time, the opportunities for surveillance and policing are going up. And it's always been this sort of like cat and mouse thing of like, what can we do before it gets rolled back? And I think that's still very much the dynamic that we're living in. There's also this slipperiness at the time around anti-trafficking and anti-immigrant policing. So 2003 with the Patriot Act is the creation of Department of Homeland Security, which did not exist before that. It's also when INS, which was civil immigration enforcement, gets moved into DHS and made criminal immigration enforcement, and the new agency is, of course, called ICE. And so within that framework, there's the Homeland Security Investigations Force, which is new, and they are engaged in both anti-immigration enforcement and anti-trafficking enforcement. And I saw that all come together for the first time in San Francisco when I was living there in 2005 with something called Operation Gilded Cage. It's a very racist framework for talking about Asian massage workers. So the idea was Asian massage businesses are hotbeds of trafficking. We don't, not because, people went in and were talking to workers and hearing about what was going on, not because workers themselves were complaining, because like the presence of these businesses were seen as organized crime. So at the time, our vice president, Kamala Harris, was the district attorney in San Francisco, and she and other law enforcement agencies, including ICE, collaborated on this raid, essentially called Operation Gilded Cage. And at the time, there was a story in the San Francisco Chronicle, which I would not describe as like all that favorable to sex workers generally, but they did interview a neighbor of one of the massage businesses that was raided. And the neighbor said when they came in here and did the raid, they came in like they were going after Osama bin Laden, right? There's just this like very scary environment where there's this slipperiness between crime and terrorism and trafficking and gangs and immigration, where just the level of surveillance and the level of policing was so oppressive, particularly for Asian immigrant communities, particularly for Muslims, and particularly for sex workers who crossed into all those communities too. So yeah, what did it all feel like, right? Because that's sort of like, okay, here's like the politics and the legal framework of that time. I mean, one thing that we were seeing as we sort of get into the 2000s is this shift of like an internet of early adopters, including sex workers, to an internet of everybody. Like all of a sudden now, like even clients who had no idea how to use the internet were on the internet, basically. There were spaces where I never thought clients would hang out, like Twitter, that all of a sudden become very important. At the same time, the media becomes very obsessed with the visibility of sex work online as a way to write stories about sex work as like a social problem. So you start getting ridiculous things like live tweeting of brothel raids by New York Times reporters. They use our visibility as a way to sort of turn us into a problem. Reporters like police who would be too lazy to go out and actually meet people in the community and see what their concerns were. Not that police ever do that, or reporters, frankly. They could just like surveil us from the internet. And the entire internet just sort of became this like peep show for people outside the sex industry to gaze at us and essentially be in the role of customers, right? It was, they would look at our advertising and think that that was like who we were. They didn't really see a distinction between how people talked about the work that they did to their own communities, their own lives, and like the ways that people would advertise. And you see that through to this day in the Backpage prosecution, where if someone said she was barely legal or new to town in her ad, that was interpreted by Congress as a minor. That was interpreted as trafficking. There's just no competency in sort of how our community works and how we talk to one another, and no understanding that ads are ads and they aren't like the same thing as a human being. So yeah, I mean, I guess I'll leave it there to have other people sort of pick up from the mid 2000s and onward. But I'll just say one more thing before I wrap up, which is one of the, I think the transformative things in this era was the first Desiree Alliance conference in 2006, which was in Las Vegas. And even though it was 2006, and even though a lot of us were online, and even though a lot of us met online, right? Like I met all the spread people online before I met them in person. This was like the first, I think, US sex worker conference or gathering where people who mostly had experience working online and only online were meeting each other in real life. And a lot of the relationships that were built there, I think, developed into just really focused and really powerful activism when it came to things like dealing with Elliot Spitzer's very public scandal around sex work, or dealing eventually with things like the war on Craigslist and then the war on Backpage and Sesta Fosta. A lot of those networks started there. And what I take away from that is like, as important as the internet was, because of the risks and the dangers around the work that we do, even the organizing work, we needed those in-person spaces to build that trust first. And once we had built that trust, it made the way that we used online spaces really different. And it actually took some of that fear down. So I'll leave it there and let other folks jump in and talk about like porn and phone sex and the iPhone. I don't know. I was going to try to end on the iPhone and be like, well, there was a financial crash in the iPhone, but you could just watch Hustlers to hear, how that story turned out.
Thank you so much for that. And, you talked about so many things that are really continuations of threads. And I think are also going to continue in the rest of our conversations. You know, thinking about what it means to work in digital space and to work in personal space, and how that changes our organizing, and you know, sometimes it makes it easier to get information out there, and also what does it mean when we develop these relationships with people's sex work personas, and when our organizing personas are very different, and our personal personas might even be a third experience. And I love how you described talking about, you know, seeing massage parlor businesses not as massage parlor businesses, but simply as the presence of organized crime. And, you know, there's so many different ways to talk about policing and to talk about the sex industry and regulation of the sex industry. And, you know, one of the things that gets brought up so much, especially in this era, in this moment, is talking about organized crime and what that means, as opposed to being like, wait, if we are all criminalized, we're all working together, that's actually just what organized crime is. And to see that and the visibility of that becoming, you know, the internet as one big peep show, I think is a fascinating evolution from this idea of the internet as content creators. And so launching into the next segment, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started working as, you know, I started off doing porn. I answered an ad in the LA Weekly, in the back of the LA Weekly, when I was 19 years old, and in 1993 to find my first porn gig. And through that, I met my first set of fairy whore mothers who were also doing porn, but later but also were dancing and you know, feature dancing and doing in-person work as well. Through meeting them, I learned how to advertise in the weekly escort papers that would be in the little red boxes on the corner of Hollywood or Sunset and La Brea. And they, you know, they really taught me how to, one, like, you know, spread out the type of income that I was making across various different ways, but also how to screen. You know, back then you would have a second landline that came into your apartment. You know, cell phones were not readily available for everyone. We still had like pagers and, you know, but you'd have a second phone line that would run into your apartment. That you would use to then screen. You would get someone's office number to be able to call the main office line and, you know, look for their number or their name in the directory, and then call their, you know, ring their office to see that they actually work at this place. This was like really rudimentary, like, you know, screening process. But one of the things that did was it eliminated blue collar clients, because there was no way of being able to verify that they were in fact working, that they had a job, that this is what their job was. Later on, we would see that with the advent of the internet and with, you know, with email becoming much more, you know, free, you know, much more easily accessible, and cell phones having cameras, you know, you could have someone send you a photo of their union card that you could then verify that they're a member of a union. But I think, you know, but part of the ways in which we were screening at that time, I think really, you know, lent to this idea that most clients were, you know, wealthy, middle-aged white men who had office jobs, because that's how you were able to verify someone, unless they had a particular type of, unless you know, you were bold enough or brave enough to call someone's union and pretend to be a apartment, you know, someone for an apartment or whatever, to verify that they work at this place, or that they were, that they had, you know, that they were a member of this, you know, this union or what have you. As we started to see legislation really go after quality of life crimes of street-based sex work, as well as cannabis, we started to see the, you know, it, like, these things started to happen right around the time that the internet was really, really booming. And so what we saw happen was folks started to move out of the papers and off the street and onto the internet. This eliminated the quality of life issues that would have people arrested for loitering or for for walking in a neighborhood that was a well-known stroll. That early age of the of websites was really interesting when I think back on it, because one of the big issues with porn sites back then was with porn design was privacy. So it was very common to design websites with a black or dark background, because there was this assumption that all porn consumers or porn surfers were married men who were looking at the internet while their wives and kids were asleep. And so the idea of having a dark background, so that if the wife came into the room while the husband is sitting in his computer room, because folks had computer rooms back then, that the glare of the white screen wouldn't bounce back on him, and then you would see, you could potentially see what it was that he was watching. After the early websites were built with HTML coding, HTML coding. But after that, but before Wix and Squarespace, what you see is what you get. Technology like Macromedia's Dreamweaver allowed sex workers and webmasters with very little coding experience to be able to edit templates and build a web presence. Where there are sex workers, there's always going to be new investors, and companies begin to pop up with templates that you could edit yourself. And then later, escort website companies would create these packages of templates that you could choose from to have a specific a escort website that didn't necessarily have to have all of the same types of things that a porn model's website would have. Like, you didn't have to have a member section. You only needed to have very basic 4 or 5 pages of information to direct customers from advertising to find all of the information that they needed about booking you. As more and more, these escort websites, web design companies would edit your template with your images and host your website for a nominal fee. As these companies began to pop up with templates that you could edit yourself, as more models moved online, the webmaster industry began to boom, offering porn performers with a high earning potential the ability to have someone not only custom build a website, but also update and manage it as well. And also cover the cost of the really outlandish website hosting fees, and then cutting the model a check by paying, by taking a percentage of the fees. So when I think about that, I think about sites like OnlyFans and all of these other current existing platforms that we use. This idea of another company taking on these fees is nothing, and charging the model for the fees is nothing new. It's something that we've been experiencing since the beginning of time, since the beginning of the internet. I mean, prior to the webmaster industry coming into play, it was very common to have hosting fees of $2,000 or $3,000 a month or more, depending on your traffic. A lot of times, and we're talking about a time when you really only had photos on your website and text. You couldn't post audio because the audio would eat up your bandwidth, and it would just shoot your hosting bills through the roof. So, imagine paying $2,000 to $3,000 a month just to post photos of yourself, not even to post like video or to post audio or to be able to even webcam, because webcamming was still really new. In the late 90s, websites like iFriends and Cam Girls Live were the early adopters of webcam technology. Often, like I actually had a webcam studio, and my guest House in North Hollywood at the time. And we had to run a T1 line into my guest house in order to be able to stream. And even then, the technology had not caught up with what we were doing. There were people who were still on 28K dial-up. And so even training the models to be able to perform on webcam, you had to really train them to kind of move very slowly and almost robotically so that their image on the other side of the screen would come across fluid. And so, but with this technology, the ways that the amount of money that you had to pay to be able to cover the cost of a T1 line going into your house so that you could have high-speed internet to stream was really, really expensive. And, while, those early sites, which I believe iFriends is still around actually, but those early websites, again, here was a way that you were able to work for a company and collect a paycheck without having very much experience and not having to have like another bit of money, having all the money for the hosting. Let's see. So with these companies, these webmaster companies, the models were really only responsible for producing the content and then, handing it over, and the web companies would do everything else. If you wanted the content edited, if you wanted the photos edited, they would pop your website address on there. And but that barrier to entry for people without tech skills, without the ability to edit a Dreamweaver template, and without the money to pay these high hosting fees, moved a lot of sex workers who were already performing in the porn space online. So one of the things that I've been thinking about lately is how Telegram groups allow sex workers to repost content of one another to drive traffic, because of the ways in which Google has made it very difficult for sex workers to be able to be found through a Google search these days. The predecessor of this was a form of content trading, where models would exchange galleries of images and use them as filler content for their posting schedule. It was, from the very beginning, we understood that it was unrealistic to post content every single day. So by bringing in, by getting galleries of images from other models, you would be able to post your friends of your friend of the week, or your Woman Crush Wednesday was our version of a Woman Crush Wednesday. Prior to hashtags, but you could post, other models every week on your content schedule. One of the ways, these models would also be listed on your links page. So later the term links, or very quickly, the term links shifted to friends. And in order to give the content a more personable feel, which plays into the consumer fantasy that all sex workers who have sex with one another know each other well and frequently have sex with one another off camera. For those who also do in-person work, the friends page doubled for those who might be available for partnered sessions or in cities that one might frequently visit. There was an understanding that surfers didn't want to click links that would take them off their websites. Keep in mind that the very first ad blocker was created as a side project in 2002. It didn't become a popular thing for your website to have ad blockers until 2009. So we're talking about, like, my first website went up in 1999. nastycinnamon.com if you want to look at the Wayback Machine, actually. So, but so imagine that from 1999 to 2009, there were no ad blockers, really. So the pop-up website ads often contained viruses that would destroy your computer. Laptops were really expensive. Desktops were really expensive still. And so what we would do at that time is instead of having text links of your friends, the websites, we started creating these gallery pages that featured thumbnails of the models on your friends list. And then when someone would click that image, it would take them to their website. So this was a really innovative way of being able to drive traffic that without having to let people know that they were leaving your website. Let's see, early forms of social media like Yahoo groups, Friendster, MySpace, Black Planet, and Mijente allowed sex workers to have direct contact with fans and to let them in on their day-to-day lives. The very first sex worker blogger that I remember is Christian Triple X, an openly bi male porn performer who blogged daily for 1 year on MySpace. Later, sites like LiveJournal and Bloggers integration with WordPress granted all sex workers the ability to blog and generate traffic via Google to their websites. In the late 90s, we saw as the folks were starting to use the internet to travel, you're using the internet for sex work, message boards were popping up. We would see clients would reach out to models in adjacent cities or in other cities, and they would pitch models to travel to their city by them organizing together to be able to promise a model like a certain number of bookings in order to travel to that city. From that, we would see escort ad malls pop up that would, the escort ad malls were really created to showcase the models or the sex workers in those cities for traveling businessmen. But what we quickly saw was that the clients would contact the sex workers and say, hey, would you travel to this city? How much money would you need to be guaranteed in order to travel? And that started the touring escort. Later we'd see, ad malls like Exotics USA and Eros pop up, and they would then I'm sorry, let me jump back up. Yeah, so we'd see these ad malls pop up, and they would then give us our, they would give these, escorts the opportunity to be able to tour. Because there were so many people touring, there were escort agencies like Exotica 2000, Body Miracle, who specifically were looking to work with either models from the Eastern Bloc or porn performers, who they quickly realized that because of their name and their experience in the industry and their star power, that they could charge double or triple the amount of money. Exotica 2000 was a Russian mob-owned escort agency who had two separate divisions. They would frequently bring in models from the Eastern Bloc who they could bill as, because of their looks, they could bill them as, bikini models, Victoria's Secret models, like they could, whatever they could bill them as models and charge on par with what they were charging for porn stars. And then they had a separate porn star division that exclusively toured porn stars from state to state. Exotica 2000 was shut down in I can't remember what year, but they were eventually shut down by the feds for money laundering and their ties to the Russian mob. We would see they actually, I think it was, there were two of their Eastern European models who were arrested, and because of their visa status, they were able to, the FBI was able to use them to flip on the agency. And the agency eventually was shut down for tax evasion is what they were shut down for. So it's, I think it's important also to note that, as when you are, anytime you cross state lines with the intent to commit a crime, it is a felony. So for a lot of models, for a lot of sex workers, it was ideal to work for an agency who you could entrust to screen your bookings and also take deposits. The cost of travel is so expensive, regardless of whether you are someone who is just starting out or you're someone who's more established. When you think about things like flights, hotels, all of that, and it's never guaranteed that people are going to show up. People will get cold feet. People will change their mind, and so deposits became a really important part of the touring sex work industry. One of the things that sex workers quickly discovered was that the law enforcement will not send money ahead of time. And so it became it became a thing where if you take a deposit, you're less likely to be running into a cop than you would if you were not taking a deposit. People started using prepaid debit cards in order to collect their deposits. At that time, you could go to any 7-Eleven, any drugstore, and you could pick up a refill card that you could then send someone the number on the back of it and they could add it to their prepaid debit card. This allowed sex workers to collect their money, without it being, this is like kind of pre-electronically collecting money, and then they would also have that debit card that they could then use to be able to check into a hotel, purchase their flights, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of like, if you think about, this is pre-Cash App, Venmo, PayPal, sex workers were already finding ways to collect money from clients before going to an appointment or before getting on a plane or a train. One of the other ways that sex workers were collecting deposits were through Western Union, because Western Union, you don't have to have ID. You only have to have an ID question. So you could use any name that you wanted and tell them that the person that's picking up money doesn't have ID, and then give them a question and answer that they could use to pick up the money. The thing about that is that Western Union, is also has to be responsible to the federal government in terms of financial reporting. And so there have been sex workers who have run into some issues with collecting large amounts of money from Western Union. And that money is, if you are receiving, it is subject to suspicious activity tracing, the same way that any other banking system that we use is. Let's see. And I wanted to talk about, and I'm going to stop there actually. So, because I think I just gave everybody like a lot of information. So,
but it's such fantastic information. All of that super fascinating. And so many of the things that you mentioned, I think really resonate with a lot of folks, like what it means to meet your fairy whore mother and learning how to screen and how we learn how to screen from each other. I feel like we talk all the time about, if you want to become an accountant, you learn how to become an accountant by going through the program, and there's not that for sex workers. And so, there's the times where you're like making it up as you go along. And so connecting with people, and especially online and in person, is also about just like learning how to do this in a way that's not accessible otherwise. And I think what you were saying about how sex workers' creativity and innovation is making me think so much about how it's created our algorithms that we no longer, that are then kind of weaponized against folks, to be like, well, you're doing this and that means you're a bot, as opposed to like, you're doing this and that means actually you're an innovative, brilliant person who's navigating the internet. And so last but certainly not least, Tina, do you want to bring us home?
I'll bring you home. I don't know. I'm a sleazebag. Sorry, not sorry. I'm feeling so emotional about how fucking amazing the people that I know are, and how we're talking about the internet and how like frustrating and alienating it can be, but also like here we are being able to connect. It feels really good. So here's where I want to start. I started doing sex work in 2005, which was the year that Spectator magazine folded. So Spectator magazine advertised themselves as California's original adult news magazine. It was founded in 1978, and it was both a, BDSM and kink subculture rag, the kind that you would find the way that you used to be able to find the Village Voice or East Bay Express in these like metal boxes, right? And it, of course, it, like the Village Voice and many other local weeklies, the Spectator magazine had all kinds of sex work ads in it. And so the fact that I've always found it very significant that I started the year that magazine no longer existed, and it was and I think that this is indicative of, so I was born in 1982, and now I've been calling myself like a Gen X millennial, like generation straddler for a while. Now they're calling us geriatric millennials, which is great. But so I have always felt like in between a lot of those things, like we got the internet in my house partially because my family worked in cable, which was the internet of the 80s and 90s, but like media and communications technology. So we got it probably earlier than a lot of other people my age. We got it when I was 13. So my like adolescence is very pegged, if you will, to the like nascent internet. But so going fast forwarding to 2005, when I was 24, I found my first jobs working in dungeons by typing the word dominatrix into the adult gigs section of Craigslist. And the dungeon that I ended up working in the East Bay, the San Francisco East Bay, for close to 5 years, had been open since the early 90s. And they had a very basic website. I actually looked at it the other day because they're still open and the website is still up, and it is still pretty basic. And the website just had profiles and booking instructions. Now there's an email on the site, and I have no idea who monitors that or how they manage it. But at the time we just had a phone number, so you could, when I started working in dungeons, you could not email the dungeon to book. And the dungeon advertised on Aeroskype. We paid, and when I say we, I mean the owner, my boss, paid for one ad in Aeroskype, and I believe that she consistently paid for it. You could pay to be like in the top 3 ads that the first 3 ads that were seen. And we had a system that rotated through whoever was working in the house. So everybody would get featured on that. And then you could also pay for your own ad. I think that there was a period of time also where she paid for the ad for the house and then like 3 individual ads as part of working there, and that rotated as well. But then there was also at the time the ability to, and like Kate was saying, I learned all of this about this world like through experience and from my horror mothers and from my dom mom. And I did actually ask my dom mom, who was on the cover of Spectator magazine twice, if she had pictures of those, and she did send them to me. So I can drop that in the chat when we're done if you guys want to see that. She looks great. So yeah, and I was learning about how people were also, how we could advertise on my Redbook, on Max Fish. There were early blogs. There was also a website, I didn't check to see if it's still around, called Model Mayhem, where you could find photographers to take your pictures, which you needed to do in order to advertise your services. And there were a lot of what we called GWCs, which is guys with camera, guys who considered themselves professional photographers because they had a camera. And this was before I would have considered, I mean, I didn't have a smartphone. I got a smartphone in 2013. So, but nobody that I knew was like taking pictures of themselves on their smartphones to advertise. So you needed to find somebody with a camera and do something that we called TFP, which is trade for print, which is basically just these guys, most of whom were hobbyists who figured out that they could essentially get a free session of hanging out with babes if they took pictures of us, which were usually not very great. So that was an example of an early thing that we had to figure out how to navigate in order to get a thing that we needed, which was pictures of ourselves, so that people would know what we looked like, so the clients would know what we looked like, so that they could book sessions with us. And I distinctly remember, and a big part of what I really want to talk about today is this like particular generation and this particular era that I was a part of. My friend Lorelei Lee, who's very involved in hacking hustling, often jokes that like you can really tell somebody's age in the industry, like in sex work years, by like whether or not you have like a VHS copy of a porn that you were in, which she and I both do, and and then also, not to get too like far afield, but also like what you remember your like session like music being on. So like I like have a lot of very vivid memories of like Portishead burned CDs, and like the Lost Highway soundtrack burned CD. So anyway, I remember being advised to start a blog to advertise, like and also to like get on like MaxFish and like other message boards and like interact with clients and like erotic review and like interact with clients. And this was like my earliest experience of bristling at the idea of like offering free labor, like what I felt like what Melissa was talking about with like user generated content. Like I felt like, and maybe it's also because I'm a writer and I'm not a professional writer, but like I had like sort of already like transgressed in this way where it was like, okay, I'm gonna like charge for my time for like intimate interactions, and I'm gonna like learn how to do all this like depraved shit like as my work, as my survival. And then like the idea that then I would give away like my off the clock thoughts for free was just like anathema to me from the beginning. Caveat to all of this is that I have no judgment of people who figured out for whom that worked, and like figured out like even if they didn't like it, that they were pragmatic about it and could make it work. Not to get ahead of myself, but obviously this is something that sex workers today are, I mean, I can't even imagine somebody like trying to be a sex worker today without like giving access to all of their off the clock thoughts and pictures, and also like the raw material of like facts about who they are. But I will get into that more, and I would love that to be a discussion topic as well. But anyway, so I never did that. I hated the idea. And I think that the way that the culture of that particular dungeon worked really sort of helped me to build my own sense of like what raw material of myself I used to create the persona of Tina Horn, and how that I felt comfortable that was something that I could market, and that was something that was for sale, or that service was something that was available to rent. And that the idea of being, and I wrote a sort of a piece about this, actually. I'll just go ahead and drop it in the chat now, for a feminist blog called The Establishment, about how I felt that I learned about that emotional compartmentalization because I worked in a place where like a client could book me and then I was like a jukebox, and you could like I would like play songs as long as you were like putting coins in the jukebox, but like if you didn't have any more coins to put in the jukebox, you can't hear any of my songs. And to talk a little bit more about the technology mediated like structures that I inherited at that dungeon, our booking system was a client would call on the phone, on the landline, and we would pick up. And by the way, everyone was required to have a different name for how they answered the phone, right? Because mistresses don't come to the phone, because mistresses like eating each other's pussies and like eating chocolate all day and like can't like aren't gonna like come to the phone, right, and take your booking. But it actually also had so that facilitated the fantasy while also protecting our safety, but also like facilitating things working more efficiently. Because if a client is talking to someone that they know that they can potentially book with, they're more likely to be a wanker. They're more likely to just get off on that experience of talking to that person. Whereas if you make it really clear, like, I'm not available, I'm the person that you have to talk to in order to see the person that you want to see. Now, as we all know, everybody wants the thing that's not on the menu. So that's like something that you always have to manage. But I found it personally easier to like be Kylie with my Laura Palmer voice and be like, oh, no. Like, I know that people always say that I sound like Tina, but I'm not Tina. Anyway, when would you like to book? When would you like to book? When would you like to book? And we, so a client would call and then they had to call back at a particular, we would give them a time, they had to call back. And then on their first bookings, they had to go to a particular intersection in the East Bay. And it had been this intersection for many, many years. And the reason that we use this intersection is that at this intersection was something called a payphone. And the clients had to call the house from the payphone. And during the time I was there, from like 2005 to 2010, we started to like slightly like allow people to call from their cell phones, because what they did when they called from the payphone was they had to describe the intersection, right? So they had to prove that they were actually at that intersection. And what this did, and I actually think it was brilliant and worked really well, was start to put the client in the frame of mind of following protocol. And by the way, some of these clients were not submissive. Sometimes they wanted to come to the house to do a session where the worker was submissive or switched, or sometimes they were just fetish sessions. So it wasn't necessarily putting them in the frame of mind of being dominated, but following protocol and realizing that they had to engage with us on our terms, and they had to pay attention if they wanted to get what they wanted. And I actually think that it was very effective, because by the time a client would then show up and be let in the door and sat down in the negotiation room, they were already used to following our lead. And, you know, Cinnamon's verification story reminds me of, to jump around in time, how later around 2013, 2014, when I worked in massage parlors in Midtown Manhattan, we were instructed to screen clients based on their Facebook profiles. And I'm going to come back to social media and early social media in a second, but I think again that whether it's my personality or like how much it has to do with my personality and how much it has to do with my generation, like, remains to be seen, but or will forever be a mystery. But I found that very stupid, frankly. I found a lot about the way that those places were run very stupid, including the fact that we were actually really at the mercy of what clients said on review boards, which was not something that I was used to in the dungeon culture in the East Bay. they could say whatever they wanted on message boards, and we did things our way, which I appreciated. And so then at the massage parlors, like, yeah, we were much more at the mercy of like guys writing reviews on the internet, which is like not human beings like at their best or more or like least vindictive. I think we all know that. But yeah, I think that the idea that if you could find a client's Facebook that demonstrated something about their like veracity or like how safe they would be as a client, again, was anathema to me. So after working in person for many years, I moved into making content that would live online when I started making porn. I was very lucky to live in the Bay Area during this very short boom of what sort of was like, had like an umbrella term or like genre that we're like still deliberating about, of feminist porn, partially because in Toronto, the Good for Her, which is a small sex positive boutique pleasure product store, had started the Feminist Porn Awards, which ran for about a decade, I think 2006 to 2016, which had a conference for a couple of years. And you know, so I was really lucky to live in the Bay when there was actually like some money being put into you know, other pleasure positive shops like Good Vibrations, into, you know, making what was like seen genre wise in terms of aesthetics, and then also considered in terms of like ethical production to be feminist porn, you know, which was like indie, artsy, political, queer, kinky. And so myself and other people who are used to in-person sex work, you know, had the ability to, you know, get paid a few $100s to fuck our friends and then like be a talking head, like saying whatever our like 20-year-old brains like thought about sexuality at the time. And then of course there was kink.com, which was a little bit more like getting, you know, paid by a client. But and people had all kinds of experiences working for kink.com. But one thing we can say for sure is that it was an opportunity for sex workers to make decent money in the Bay Area at the time, like in the again, they owned the Armory for, I mean, they still exist, but kink.com was in the Armory also for about a decade around the same time. I am running a little bit short on time, so what I want to say a couple of things really quick. I just want to note something that doesn't really get talked about that much, which is that Pink and White Productions, who are known for Crash Pad series, another queer indie POC owned porn company that got its start in the Bay Area around this era and is still around. They also run something called Pink Label TV, which I personally is like one of the top like subscription or VOD sites that I recommend to people if they're looking for porn that is curated to be ethical or feminist, which is super complicated, but that's another panel. But something that Pink and White and Shine Louise Houston did in 2009 was choose about half a dozen sex workers or sex educators and give us these things that were called flip cameras, which were about the size and shape of a smartphone, like a little thicker and heavier. And they basically gave us a very small budget to make whatever porn we wanted. And it was called, it was a project called Point of Contact, which you can still see on Pink Label TV. And in some ways, I think that they were really kind of at the cutting edge of the idea of porn as reality TV. And you know, it really actually did, you know, put the means of production in our hands as workers and performers. And, you know, we had to figure out things like, you know, we would perform in the way that people who run clip stores and OnlyFans and their own membership sites now, with as video consumer technology has really changed from the world of these like flip video cameras, which like became outdated in like 6 months and are basically junk now. But the way that we would like perform in each other's videos to save money, and then also I can't express to you how novel it was to me in 2009 to have a camera this big and then to like stage a kink scene or a sex scene and to just like point this thing at what was happening and like try to get some close-ups and try to get some wide shots and like try to do all of this stuff. And you know, now this is the way that people make adult content on the internet. I mean, pretty much everybody. And Kate mentioned 2257s, and this was another big lesson that I learned from that project was you got to get people to sign their 2257s or like whatever industry you're in or whatever you're doing. Like if you need people to sign a release form of any kind, like please do it while you have them there as your protocol as part of the moment, because I spent a lot of 2009 riding my bike around the East Bay, going to people's straight jobs where they were very grumpy about having to like come outside and like sign a porn form because I had like forgotten in my horny filmmaking moments to have them sign that paperwork. So again, I am I think I'm at time, and that brings us to about 2010, which I think is where we're supposed to be. I did also want to talk a little bit about about like sex workers and social media. So I'll just go ahead and drop a couple of articles that I have written on the subject in the chat, and just end by saying that I never wanted to join I never wanted to join social media for the same reason that I was talking about earlier, that I never wanted to blog as Tina Horn in order to get clients, because I just saw it as like giving away labor for free. And then some of my like queer porn friends in 2009, I think, started a Twitter account at Tina Horn's ass and started like tweeting as my ass, which is my most famous and noticeable asset. And after a while, I was like, all right, just give me the password and like I'll start tweeting as that. And that's still my Twitter handle, and now it's my Instagram handle. And it was the only way that I could understand who Tina Horn could be on social media, was by it just being very direct that it was about my ass first and foremost.
Thank you so much for all of that. And I'm just going to really quickly get some housekeeping out of the way and then turn it back. I know, Cinnamon, you wanted to say something about screening. And then I have one question for everyone, and then we're going to turn it over to a conversation, hopefully actually with that question in mind. But just to wrap up with the pieces we have to. So we're going to be sending out some resources to explore on here. Actually, you know, the kink.com conversation is really keyed into our first piece, which is a document, or the first resource here, which is a documentary about the pre-kink website insects.com, which, like, if kink.com is like the shiny version, graphic sexual horrors about insects, which is like the message boards. Next is a book, Naked on the Internet by Audacia Ray, who is not only kind of talks about being naked on the internet, but is also the founder of the Red Umbrella Project in New York. The next article is a really interesting piece. If you're thinking about and talking about regulation, especially obscenity regulation, this is specifically about a time at the DOJ where they were looking at that and featuring someone who was the DOJ who really pushed back on the idea of only going after child pornography and wanted to really tackle obscenity, who is now, if you've heard of Nkosi, the executive director. So that is a fascinating article to read. And then a few more pieces kind of about the history of the internet, and talking about sex work on it. Another documentary, which is about Pandora's Box, was a dungeon in New York back in 1996. It still exists, but a really interesting moment in time and a really unique level of access for a journalist who is a little bit challenging. And then we're hoping to also have a few minutes to talk about the trailer for Zola. If you guys haven't seen it, you'll get a link to it. Please Google it. And the conversation about social media and what that means in translating sex workers' lives. And then we're hoping everyone will join us next Friday, where we're going to have Gabriella and Lorelei Lee talk about kind of the moment that we're in now and what this moment is around post-FOSTA SESTA, post-free Earn It, whatever, the Russia stuff, the Facebook stuff. What does regulation of the internet, regulation of digital spaces, regulation of the sex industry mean when it comes together in a moment where we have more visibility and more organizing around federal political issues than has ever been true in the history of the United States? So it's going to be a great final conversation to bring folks in and to talk about where we are right now. And so, Cinnamon, you wanted to say something about screening, and then I have one more conversation, one more question for our panelists.
Yeah, there were two things that Tina brought up that I just wanted to kind of like to piggyback on, where the ways in which Tina described people being sent to the corner to call the dungeon as a checkpoint. In New York in the early 2000s, most of the they would be called brothels, but most of the like escort booking locations would always rent the front apartment so that they could actually look out the window to see the person on the corner, whereas the dungeons didn't have that that ability to do that, because most of the dungeons in New York City are underground, or were at that time underground, basement of locations. So that was just something that I wanted to like kind of to point, like how it went from calling to describe the location to like calling to and then looking out the window to see the person. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention was, let me just look at the same way in which Tina described using Facebook to verify people. As soon as LinkedIn became a thing, here you have people are providing all of their work information right in one spot on the internet, and it became a very easy way to like follow. It's like you can look at their LinkedIn, see how long they've been working, look at all of their other information, see that they have some engagement with other people from their company on the page. And so this was, sex workers, most sex workers that I know now use LinkedIn as a secondary form of verification. So I just wanted to touch on those two things. Oh, and also like Tina was talking about the flip cameras. Prior to flip cameras, we used to have to, I actually used to run my FireWire cable from my Sony Handycam into my MacBook in order to stream like video live, or to be able to record directly, to dump it onto my laptop as well. So we're seeing this kind of progression of the technology in like in various different experiences at different times.
Yeah, the conversation about screening is so fascinating in the ways they, trying to work around that. And so one thing that all three of y'all brought up, and Tina, I love this phrase, what raw material of myself can I market? And so the question I would love to pose to the three of you, and it's kind of like a half-baked question anyway, is, in the conversations about developing these personas, about marketing these personas, about having media around them, about having access to the day-to-day lives of a persona, that kind of against the fact that all y'all are also real people and organizers. And as we're developing relationships with each other, with other workers, with clients in these different spaces, at the same time that surveillance is increasing and often using the same mediums to do it, what was navigating like that what was navigating some of those challenges like, and what has it been like, especially because, I also love this panel because everyone's kind of the same age-ish. And, when you start your sex work persona, you'd never, at least 15 years ago, it wasn't the same that it was now. And it was a lot easier to kind of draw these lines. And so I was hoping you guys could kind of speak to what that means, especially within the context of like increasing surveillance, where, we open up our Signal and 4 clients have now joined Signal and it alerts us. And so, yeah, I was hoping y'all could kind of talk about that, and then hoping that could pivot us into a broader conversation with everyone who's sitting here with us.
Oh yeah, like you open up Signal and it's like the name that you've given the client in your phone. So it's like Steve cross-dressing, Steve like wanker, Steve never call again, Steve like $, $. They're all Steve. Well, one place that I really want to start is that I feel like you can really tell when you interact with someone online, which is especially in this past year, not to put too fine a point on it, is like what public space is and how we interact with people. You can really tell if someone has participated in an informal criminalized economy based on their relationship to, again, like what raw material of themselves they'll just like fucking let hang out there. And apparently like we're the ones with bad boundaries, but like when people are like, here's a picture of me in front of my house. Or like, so I wanted to say that. And then another thing that I wanted to say is that like, I'm at the cynical point now where I literally don't understand why people have social media if it's not to sell something, because like I feel like as sex workers, we understood intuitively from the beginning of social media, maybe even from the beginning of the internet, that like the reason to be online is to sell something. And like now to sell like this, to sell ourselves, like to sell, and obviously we push back a lot against the idea of like we're selling our bodies, or we're selling like the right to like look at our bodies, and we can problematize that here and everywhere forever. But like when like other people are using your online presence to sell shit, so that's not, everybody here knows that is not like tinfoil hat talk. That's just a fact. And like, but I feel like in terms of like Elliot mentioned in the chat, like that they are studying the psychological effects of like persona making on workers, and like especially what that means when people are constantly being deplatformed and decriminalized, or criminalized, should be decriminalized. But like I've always said that, for example, like I know exactly how to talk to @CinnamonLove on Twitter when I know that I know, and I think it's important to always acknowledge that we are being voyeured, that our conversations are being voyeured to, and that if I have something that I want to say to Cinnamon, if I think that there's any possibility that it will help either of us make money, I'll say it to her on Twitter. Same with @Melissa Gira, and like, but if there's something that I want to say to them that may in any that I just prefer like not to make available for as part of our brand, like I'm gonna send them a signal. And like it's really weird to me when people are on social media under their legal names and they're behaving in ways that I think of as what you would use to sell something, and I guess they're just in it for the dopamine, which again, it's like no judgment, but it's unfathomable to me.
Especially this year, right? Like I'm going to kind of start with this year and work backwards. So I wrote this, I guess like a year ago. Yeah, May 13th. Yikes. Last year. The coronavirus is making us all cam girls right now. I was so fucking alienated. Like, okay, I have like a light now. I haven't like lit myself at my computer. God, I think I probably used like a gooseneck desk lamp, to be honest, when I was camming, because that was a really cheap adjustable light. I remember, hold on. You know, Steve Jobs fucking sucks because he put, here it is, the webcam in a place where we all look like shit on a laptop, right? This is my very first webcam. This is from the year 2000. And so having a camera on a tripod, like, why wouldn't you want to control your angles? And so I'm watching all these people on Zoom who've clearly never had this experience before. But on the other hand, I'm super hostile to doing it well because I'm not being paid to do that well. I'm just in a fucking work meeting where we're talking about what we're writing this week. Why do I have to look cute? And so I was like aggressively ugly. I feel like for the first year of the pandemic, I just couldn't handle it. I was like, I'm not gonna be cute. Like, you can't pay me to be cute at work. My job at work is to show up and write. That's what I do for a living. And then at a certain point, I was like, this is going to go on for a long time. I should figure out how to be a real person in this moment. And for people who've never had to figure out how to be a real person on camera in their house, I don't know how you just made it through the last year. Honestly, I don't know. People who've never had to think about how to assemble a backdrop. Like, I've just settled on something ridiculous because I don't have to think about it. So I was born in 78, but I got online in 94 when I was 16 years old. So I also feel that's like, I'm Gen X in age, 100%, but I'm a millennial in internet years because I've been online since I was a teen. And I was also online in a time where it was just purely creative, non-commercial, like you were here to express yourself, but not under your real name. Because that's like, why would you do that? There's too many creeps. And
Also, if you were a teenager,
yeah,
you
that's
were there.
I mean,
You were
AOL
there.
was a dicey
Well, I
place.
was just gonna say, like, I don't know about y'all, but for me, it was definitely like, oh, there's porn here. I
Yeah,
can
I mean,
I can make, like, you know, erotic fan fiction about the X-Files
yeah,
and then upload it to a server and then download you know, erotic drawings of the characters from Animaniacs like that.
you know, there was a lot of weird Disney stuff. You know, like yeah, I'm just gonna leave that there. And you would like have to go on a Usenet news group to download it, and you would literally get like 10 pixels at a time. You know, loading. The idea that porn was really easy
The
to get in the
original
90s is like, I'm sorry.
Season Denial.
Yeah, no, it wasn't easy at all. Yeah, it was literally a peep show on your browser. It was moving so slow. Anyway, I spent most of my first, I don't know, decade on the internet, not under my own name, and doing sex work under a different, not my own name, several different, not my own names. And then I just hit this sort of point, like you're talking about, Tina, around writing, where it's like, I've always known that this is what I want to do. And the internet has changed such that I probably have to pick with one identity to go with. There was just like a moment somewhere in the mid-aughts. And when I started working for Valleywag, which was Gawker's tech blog, is essentially when I took the one name that I have and will always have. That's mostly my real name, but actually not entirely. So I still feel like I have a little cover, even though the government's happy to pay me under that name. So it's a mess. In terms of my tactics, I chose a name where I knew I was going to have max SEO value to change it, which Gawker.com in 2007 is pretty good in terms of SEO if you're going to change your persona. And so as a result, my entire time on social media, even though I was doing sex work while I was on social media, I only ever used it under that one persona, under my actual name, the name I wrote my book under, the name I'm here under. Like, I had to have that division. And I even tried to have like a sex work Tumblr, like a Dom Tumblr. That was a mistake. Like, I was just like very low tech as a worker, the more I wanted to use social media as the rest of my life.
Yeah, I totally relate there. I mean, Model Mayhem, One Model Place, you know, they really allowed me as a performer, particularly like as a marginalized performer. We do, you know, there's a couple things. Right? So I'm trying to figure out how to start this, but there's no innovation in porn, like really. You know, when you walk through the door as a performer, you are only cast for roles that you look like when you walk through the door. And so, you know, the directors are not looking at someone who is 18 and looks like a cheerleader, thinking that they could make them into a glamorous model, right? So websites, like for me, Hem and One Model Play, I keep wanting to say OnlyFans, and One Model Place, like really allowed me to be able to have exposure to photographers that allowed me to rebrand myself in a way that could, so that I could get jobs that were not that, you know, fit other kinds of you know, other ways. Like that was the reason, that was the way that I was able to stay in the business for so long, because, you know, you can only be barely legal for about 3 or 4 years, and then, you know, it's just not believable anymore, and then you have to do something else. And so for usually that's when people get kind of pushed out or edged out. And, you know, back then the MILF, you know, wasn't really something that was a thing yet. And so by using these kinds of platforms, I was able to shoot with these photographers. I was able to I discovered that, you know, Playmates, as a part of their contract, could not do hardcore porn, but they could do like fetish stuff. So if I shot with these photographers that are shooting Playmates, then I could, you know, by doing this kind of glamour fetish photography, then now I'm on websites with other glamour, you know, with these glamour models, and it ups my value as a brand. Like for me, like, you know, these days we see like with escorts creating these luxury, you know, luxury brand personas. Like that's essentially what I was doing by shooting with people like Christine Kessler and Ashley Fontanon, and, you know, now Shabari, and like there's all these different people that I was able to work with who gave me images that I was able to then use to pitch myself to porn producers, to get those other kinds of roles, and also to book with clients at a higher rate. And so for me, like that was a big part of it for me, but also because I had a lot of early exposure to message boards, a lot of the porn message boards where people were file sharing, they were ripping content off of your website and reposting it. And I had these kind of like very, tense relationships with these forums, where I'd go on and be like, yo, like I don't have a shit ton of money, like stop stealing from me. But that created this pathway to like kind of opening the door to talk about like the reality of my life and the reality of what it means to be a porn performer. And, you know, the fact that I'm a single parent and I'm raising these kids, and I've got like to really I started to humanize myself with my consumers, mostly to get them to stop stealing from me, and also to like report back to me when other people were stealing content, because it wasn't as easy to track your stolen content, like, you know, back then as it is now. And so, you know, so that was really important for me. And you know, when I started on, you know, blogging, and then later when I joined Twitter in 2007, it was really, you know, allowing people to see me as a human being became part of the brand, you know, because I am you know, it's like I really pushed for authentic branding, because from the very beginning, when I first started in the business, I was told only do things that you want to do, because you can only fake it for so long. And so like that became that was my, and still is my branding. It's just so much easier to be myself. Like I'm just not that good of an actress, and I'm not trying, it's just too much work to try to pretend to be somebody else. But I will say that, you know, there are parts of that I regret, because when I was doxxed back in whatever year of the big AIM healthcare debacle, you know, people, you know, they listed the Real Porn WikiLeaks listed my children's, my then minor children's links to their Facebook pages. My then 11-year-old daughter got a DM from someone telling her that she was telling them that they were going to be a dick sucker like mommy. You know, it's like the kinds of, you know, my address was posted online, my real name was posted online, people were contacting other family members. Like, you know, it's like that was, you know, I could have never have foreseen that by simply existing as myself but using my stage name, that the fact that I was bold enough to talk about being a parent and a whore in the same line would get me on this list of doxed sex workers. And so, you know, so there is a huge there's a lot of risk to being that open about who you are and your reality. But at the same time, like you know, it is beneficial because people talk about, and Tina kind of touched on this. People often talk about like that we, you know, sex workers are selling their bodies. Really, we're selling an experience. Even if that experience is casual sex, we're still selling an experience. You know, people who are interested in, you know, cheerleader porn, by and large, are interested in the girl that got away, right? Or the girl that they didn't have when they were in college or in high school. People who are interested in the MILFs are, and Tina knows a lot about this stuff because Tina has had a long running show on why are people into that. But it's, you know, it's like, you know, really, you know, when you start to look at why are people into the types of sex that they're into, what kind of of porn and thereby porn performers, or what kinds of escorts are they booking, it all boils down to some psychological attachment to that particular thing that their fantasy is. And so really, all sex workers are selling a fantasy. The type of fantasy that they're selling will determine the kind of client that they get. It'll determine the kind of money that they're able to make, and the branding and marketing. It really is. I mean, the most successful sex workers are the ones who really should be working in, in these high-end marketing firms, teaching people how to sell ethically to customers, right? So
Thank you for sharing that. And so we're going to turn off the recording and kind of open it up. First and foremost, thank you to our panel. This was phenomenal, and this conversation, I think, has sparked so much and has resonated so deeply. And as we shift over into the conversation, so many of the things that you mentioned and that we just talked about around these different personas, about how our work personas are also like, they're authentic and they're also responsive to clients. And so what does it mean to connect across something that is actually a reflection of a client base and the pieces of raw material that fit into that? And then, what you just said, I think, was so impactful, that very often that gets taken up to be like, sex workers are X. And, and we're going to create legislation based on this concept of victimization and these narratives of victimization, which sex workers can't be because we're reading these personas. And then at the same time, when we let people in just a little bit, it gets weaponized against us so quickly. And I know that I know how deeply that resonates. And so we're going to shut off the recording and we're going to ask folks to, we know we only have,